President Lee Jae-myung prays for peace on the Korean peninsula as his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump touts a peace agreement with Iran. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Monday's edition of Press Perspective for June 15th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we continue our coverage of President Lee Jae-myung's Europe tour as he meets with officials at the Vatican City before heading to France for this year's Group of Seven summit that comes against the backdrop about news of a tentative framework for peace between the US and Iran. For more on this, our freelance reporter David Lee here in the studio. David, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have a freelance journalist, Raphael Rashid, with us. Raphael, it's great to have you here.
Great to be back.
Right, David, we'll start with you. Let's begin with details about President Lee Jae-myung's agenda at the Vatican City, which is the third leg of his Europe tour, before we touch upon President Trump's touting of a peace deal with the US, with Iran, of course.
Yes. So the Vatican is the final leg of Lee's first European tour as president. Obviously, he will be attending the G7 summit later today. But yeah, this morning, actually, he met with Pope Leo. Earlier, he made a speech at one of the major churches in Rome, the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, where he appeared alongside South Korean-born Cardinal Lazaro Yusun-sik. And he made a comment about how he still believes in the ember of hope in reviving dialogue with North Korea. Yeah, and this comes as he was invited in Rome for an official full state visit, and he elevated the partnership with Italy and Korea to a special strategic partnership. So that was significant. And last week, actually, he was also formally invited to Brussels, where there was a EU-Korea summit. And during the meetings, they really focused on strengthening their economic ties, building coordination in global security issues. So obviously the wars in Ukraine and Iran came up. And, the European states also expressed their commitment to support in enforcing stability in the Korean Peninsula. So really the big picture here is that, because it's his first official European tour as president, it's really an opportunity to introduce his administration to his European partners and to really expand Korea's role outside of Northeast Asia.
Right. Raphael, President Lee Jae-myung's trip to the Vatican, it comes ahead of South Korea's hosting of next year's World Youth Day. Now, for the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with this particular event, could you tell us a bit about World Youth Day and the significance, of course, of South Korea hosting it next year?
Sure, yeah. So World Youth Day, it's universally known as WYD, is the Catholic Church's flagship global youth gathering. It's held internationally every 3 to 4 years approximately, and it's in a city chosen personally by the Pope himself. Despite the name of the event, it's not a single day per se, it's a multi-day pilgrimage event, typically spanning around a week in the host city, and then it culminates in an overnight vigil and an outdoor closing mass that tends to draw quite large crowds. The concept itself was born with Pope John Paul II, who invited some young people to Rome, I think it was in 1984, simply to gather in faith. But it's obviously expanded over time, and now we have these international editions that followed, I think, in 1986. And then since, there have been, I think, over 20 million cumulative pilgrims have participated in these editions across multiple countries and continents. I think one of the big ones that happened was in Manila in 1995 that drew, I believe, 4 million participants. And then we saw in Rio de Janeiro in 2013, there were around 3 million. Maybe Seoul might not have as many as that, but I think symbolically this is very distinct from other World Youth Days in that South Korea is is not a Christian country per se. It's not a majority Christian country. And actually organizers and the Vatican have framed this deliberately, positioning Seoul as a model of interreligious coexistence and community rather than showcasing the dominance of the Catholic faith. So also this is going to happen in a divided country, and there are also hopes, ambitions to see whether Pope Leo will go to the DMZ to pray for peace and unification. And of course, this event will happen in just over a year, in summer 2027. They say maybe up to 1 million people might be coming for this event.
Right, I suppose you'll be covering it next year then.
Definitely.
Hopefully, fingers crossed for that. Now, following his talks with Pope Leo XIV at the Vatican City today, President Lee Jae-myung will head to France to sit down with his G7 counterparts starting tomorrow, I believe. What has been shared about his agenda at the G7 summit this year and its significance, David?
As I mentioned before, President Lee really looks to expand South Korea's diplomatic efforts in Europe. And as we all know, it's earlier this month, it was his first-year anniversary in office, which was largely focused on his pragmatic diplomacy, which took him to several continents and countries over the year. And the summit really comes at a time when tariffs and trade uncertainty remain, major concerns for many states in the world. And this is especially important for economies like South Korea's, which really heavily depends on exports. So yeah, President Lee will also have a strong interest in attending these summits and talking with his European counterparts. AI is also expected to be a major talking point. In Korea, it's going to be very significant to position itself as a key AI player in the world. As we all know, SK Hynix, Samsung, other South Korean tech firms have really established themselves, upgraded their profile in recent months. And it really tells you how South Korea has become really central to the AI supply chain. And this is important because the G7 members, they all regard the AI supply chain as really a national security issue at this point. Yes, AI will be a headline during these summits, but also security issues remain. We know that Trump announced his preliminary peace agreement with Iran, but also the war in Ukraine is a very high interest for all European states at this moment. So these will also dominate the discussions at the summit. And for going back to President Lee, it's really his first time to meet his European partners in this format, per se. So it will be really important for him to make his presence felt, to really establish the interests of his administration, and maybe build some long-lasting personal relationships while he's there.
Right, because the last time I believe he met them was here in Gyeongju, and then of course the first time was back in Canada during his first presence at the G7 when Canada was hosting it. Raphael, President Lee Jae-myung, he's also expected to sit down with his British counterpart Keir Starmer on the sidelines of the G7 summit on Wednesday, that is. Now this particular meeting, it comes against the backdrop of news that South Korea and the UK, they've seen quite a bit of advancements in talks about critical minerals. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, yeah, the Korea-UK relationship, of course, has always been very important, but I think recently has been developing into one that may be more substantive, especially, for Seoul's diplomatic portfolio. And as you mentioned, the critical minerals are likely to be at the heart of this. If we just look at it pretty easily, the strategic logic is straightforward. South Korea is one of the world's most mineral-dependent economies. Its semiconductor industry, battery industry, they all rely on raw materials that are overwhelmingly refined in China. But of course, Beijing's recent decision, I think it was last autumn, to expand export controls targeting semiconductor users sent, I guess, a bit of a jolt to Seoul, to the Korean industry, and I think accelerated Seoul's push to diversify supply chains at least between trusted partners. Britain, of course, has been moving in that same direction, and the two countries are now working within the same framework of basically like-minded nations in coordinating mineral supply security. And South Korea has actually been chairing that that group of partner nations that share this goal and this vision. Britain has strong relationships with mineral-rich countries in Commonwealth nations across Africa and the Pacific, and of course, South Korea itself has processing technology, manufacturing capacity and capability, and the end-use industries that turn these raw materials into kind of finished products, as you will. So I think the two nations together do complement one another, and this meeting that, as you mentioned, that will take place in France, I think is expected to advance those discussions. Hopefully, we might even see a formal agreement or arrangement on the table. Critical minerals themselves have been explicitly part of the Lee Jae-myung's G7 agenda. So I think the bilateral between the two sides, I think, will definitely bring these two countries closer together. And of course, maybe the UK-Korea relations will advance to a new high, I predict, and also maybe this will lay out the kind of groundwork for hopefully seeing Lee Jae-myung visit the UK at some point in the near future.
Right, of course, keeping in mind the fact that South Korea and the UK, they do share quite a number of common interests. David, this, as we mentioned earlier, this latest Group of Seven summit, it takes place against the backdrop of a tentative framework for peace between the US and Iran. That being said, what's the latest on that front? Bring us up to speed.
Yeah, so this announcement seems to be a part of Trump's so-called big birthday weekend. It's his 80th birthday. He also had a very major mixed martial arts event where he hosted at the White House, watched by millions of people. If we get into the details, it really seems like a peace framework at this moment rather than a final settlement. So let's really go over what has been agreed according to reports. So a preliminary peace agreement has been reached where a formal signing ceremony will take place in Switzerland, planned for this Friday. So obviously an immediate ceasefire has been announced. Some of the key measures, Trump has really stressed on his social truth platform that the Strait of Hormuz has been reopened. I think he wanted to say that. So many countries around the world are very invested in the waterway being used again. And also he stressed how the U.S. naval blockade in several Iranian ports will be lifted. And as for Iran, its Security Council confirmed that conflict around all fronts, including Lebanon, would stop to exist. So while the announcement is, very welcoming for many countries around the world, a number of major questions still remain to be solved, and that's why both parties agreed to have a 60-day kind of negotiation period where major issues such as Iran's uranium stockpile, questions I should say, future nuclear restrictions on Iran, how it will be monitored and verified by the U.S. and international parties, and also sanctions relief. These will all be talked about during this period. And like I said, while this is very welcoming news, the reason that people are still skeptical until when the agreement is signed and really respected by both parties is that in April, a ceasefire was announced, but obviously many terms were violated. And then we also have the factor of third parties, the most significant coming from Israel. Israel still has troops in southern Lebanon, and they recently even fired missiles to its capital, Beirut. So these are very concerning issues that still remain to this day, and it really shows how it's simply not a two-player conflict.
Right then, Raphael, as David just mentioned, the response to this announcement of a peace tentative framework for peace between the US and Iran by Mr. Trump has been met with quite a bit of mixed response, if you will. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure, yeah. I think the response itself has been swift and I think largely welcoming across the board, although there are significant caveats or issues that remain, as David pointed out. Prime Minister Starmer called it a hugely important step forward, said the UK stands ready to support the technical talks that will follow, and raised the possibility even of British involvement in mine clearance operations in the Strait. Macron of France said that the G7 opening today in Evian will focus on the lasting reopening of Hormuz, also support for Lebanon, and concluding a formal accord on Iran's nuclear and ballistic activities. I think several European nations also signaled a readiness to lift sanctions on Tehran in exchange for concrete steps on its nuclear program, of course. Even, say, Japan's Prime Minister Takaichi also expressed hope that a final nuclear agreement would follow as soon as possible. Markets also reacted immediately. Asian equities surged this morning. We saw Japan's Nikkei up 5.4% to a record high, and we also saw South Korea's Kospi climbing 5%. Oil prices also fell sharply. But of course, the challenges, the issues are real. What was announced is technically, for now, an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. So it's not necessarily a final treaty, which they say it's set for Friday to be signed in Switzerland. Then I think there's going to be around 60 days of follow-up talks on Iran's nuclear program still ahead. Of course, I think we all hope that something positive and concrete will come out of this, but in the past agreements of this kind have always unraveled before. So I wouldn't say it's like we're at the final stage yet. Of course, there is the question of Israel. As David pointed out, a strike on Beirut on Sunday morning has prompted even Trump to publicly denounce Netanyahu, saying that the attack shouldn't have happened on a day when a peace deal was so close. Of course, Israel has not formally endorsed this agreement, and I think that remains an open fault line. But hopefully we can be positive that something fruitful will come out of this.
Right. For now, I suppose we can say the memorandum of understanding is a step in the right direction, then.
Absolutely, yeah.
David, back to the Group of Seven summit in France. There are quite a number of analysts who believe that the summit this particular year will be, and I'm quoting, a middle power moment. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, this is really one of the more interesting themes that's surrounding the summit this year. And while there really isn't a concrete definition of a middle power, I think we can say that these are countries with significant diplomatic, economic, and sometimes military influence in the world. So they're kind of below the superpowers, below the G7 and the United Nations Security Council members per se, but they're still able to shape the agenda. Global agenda in many circumstances. And the reason for their sort of rising in recent years is that these global challenges that many countries face nowadays, they're very multifaceted. They're not dependent on just the major powers. They're just very much more fragmented. So they depend on many aspects of the economy, politics, such as AI, supply chains, security issues, trade issues. So yeah, it just really tells you how major powers can't really solve all the problems by themselves. And especially in this summit, I think some points to mention is that the U.S., their influence really has deteriorated in many areas of the world due to their America First policy, really creating sort of a bad rep for them, alienating allies and creating trade tensions all over the world. And even China will not attend this summit. So those are some big points to point out. And it's really creating more space for these middle powers to maneuver, so to say. And they're increasingly seeking flexible partnerships, such as South Korea has done with its Southeast Asian allies and European partners. So they're not really choosing one side or another. As you can see with Korea, kind of walking a tightrope with US and China in many occasions. So yeah, some good examples of such middle powers is, like I keep mentioning, South Korea. It's their actually second consecutive year being invited to the summit while they're not a member. India and Brazil have also been invited at this summit. And reasons for South Korea becoming a very important middle power is due to their role as a major semiconductor and AI player in the world, their strength in advanced manufacturing, and their increased diplomatic profile. So, and some analysts have even floated the idea that these middle powers can come together and maybe even create a group like the G7, create their own middle power sort of grouping. So yeah, this really tells you how even if it's a G7 summit, it's not all about the G7 members. Yeah.
Right, it's also about its partner nations as well then. Raphael, what strengths, if you will, what are the strengths that South Korea holds as a middle power on the global stage, do you think?
Yeah, I think South Korea's case as a middle power rests on a combination of hard assets and, of course, soft ones that I think a few countries around the world, or at least countries of its size, can actually match simultaneously. On the economic side, South Korea is one of the largest, I think 12th or 13th largest economies in the world, home to Samsung, of course, and SK Hynix, which together produce quite a lot of the world's most advanced memory chips, especially at a moment when semiconductors, of course, have become the defining resource of geopolitical competition. So I think that definitely gives Seoul leverage well beyond its geographic weight. South Korea is also very strong in defense networks, military capability, and of course we can't forget the cultural influence that South Korea has at a time when Korea's pop music, films, dramas, food have created global familiarity with this country, but it also functions as a kind of diplomatic infrastructure, opening doors to countries where Seoul might not have had that maybe formal alliance or relationship in the past. I think now everyone knows Korea's name. And of course, this means that South Korea is able to forge ties, joint initiatives with countries, be it on green or renewables, even with Japan, setting differences aside and cooperating on supply chains and artificial intelligence. But I think the caveat of all of this is that if you're a middle power with influence, it depends also heavily on the stability of the rules-based order. And I think when that order fragments, maybe the smaller states tend to get a little bit squeezed. So I think right now South Korea's task is to remain indispensable enough so that it can remain in the room and be able to maneuver both different sides when it needs to, regardless of which direction these powers will be going in the future.
Right, through its pragmatic diplomacy with its current administration, of course. All right, that was our Raphael Rashid with your thoughts on the merits that South Korea holds as a middle power. I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
David, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.